Hello everybody and welcome to Truth, Lies and Hair Ties. So we are now on the third episode, all to do with orcas being in captivity. I'm now actually going to give my disclaimer down below because I think it just makes it a little bit easier. Today I've just got one hairband. You're going to need anything like this. I think I've actually got this off a belt from a dress or something, but it doesn't really matter. And you can always have a little flower clip like that I'm going to put at the end. We're basically just going to do one big braid right down the side there. Okay. I'll just part the hair before I start talking because this is the bit that I need to concentrate on just slightly. Okay. Now with the hair tie that I've got here, I'm actually just going to tie this part out of the way. And as you can see, I've got a side parting, and this is where we're going to be doing the braid. Okay, so today we are talking about a rather unique and wonderful person. His name was Alexis Martinez, and even just through looking at some of the videos that he did when he was working with these amazing animals, he had so much enthusiasm, he had so much drive. I could tell that he worked hard. He had a great smile and he could move. He could dance really, really well. And there are loads of videos where you can just see him putting so much effort into each show that he did. So yeah, so he worked at Loro Parque, which is in Spain. He was working with a killer whale called Keto. So I'll just talk a little bit about Keto. So he was actually born in captivity in 1995 at Seaworld, Orlando. Then he was shipped to San Antonio, and then he was flown, yes, flown to Loro Parque in Spain. And I thought, how on earth does that work? How do you fly a huge, massive whale? So I managed to get some pictures online. I was searching, whales on a plane, how would it work? I found one that wasn't keto, it was a slightly different one. And it just looked like it was being transported onto the plane. But then I couldn't see the conditions actually inside, how they would be stored for the flight. But I did find, which I'll put here, a beluga whale, which is obviously a lot smaller. And obviously it's quite contained to the point where it can't move, which I guess is the safest thing. But that beluga whale is actually being flown over to a sanctuary, which sounds quite nice, whereas Keto obviously would have been just brought over for entertainment for us, basically. But I think it's quite a long flight to be stuck in one position. I mean, it can't have been very comfortable, so not particularly nice. So some people say that the park wasn't really ready for these massive whales to come about. And there was actually one woman called Suzanne Alee, I think is how you say it. She was actually a former employee of the park. She worked in the visual and audio department. The park, hadn't ever had orcas before. They'd never housed anything quite as big as this. And one thing that they noticed, I don't know if it's because the whales were really bored or something, or they noticed that certain things weren't as secure. They started to peel off with their teeth something called Metflex, which is made out of rubber, and it was to help with the waterproofing of the pool. But obviously this isn't going to be good because they started to digest these bits that they were taking off, and that can't be great for their systems. So this now meant that the whales would have to have something called an endoscopy, which basically meant that a camera would have to be put down their throat, you know, in order for them to see what was going on. But what they would then have to do is they'd have this massive plank of wood that they would put into their teeth, because obviously their mouth needed to stay open. And there's a video, which you'll find below, of Keto having this done. And there's quite a few trainers on top of him, I guess, to hold him still. But this must have been quite distressing for him. He doesn't know what's going on. I'm sure it was very uncomfortable. And about halfway through this video, you do see him sort of start to move around. And I think at one point the trainers have to let go, you know, and leave him for a bit. So when I said that Keto was flown over, he wasn't the only one. There was actually 3 others with him as well. And just after 3 days of opening the park, they did a show which apparently went quite well. But then they had to shut everything down. There was obviously still quite a few repairs that needed to be done. So for 4 weeks, they just concentrated on, I don't know, I guess trying to get the whole park up and running again. But when they reopened and they were just about to do a show, the trainers spotted this Metflex stuff hanging from their mouths, and some of the paint had gotten on them as well. And I think at this point the trainers really wanted the show to go ahead. You know, they had probably loads of people outside waiting. And so they tried to use some sort of alcohol-based chemical thing to get it all off. But it didn't work because they weren't obeying any orders. They were just so fascinated with ripping off this stuff that they basically couldn't get these animals under control, and so the show couldn't carry on. So you guessed it, the park had to close yet again, and the whales were put into the smaller 2 back pools for 10 weeks whilst the main pool was being repaired, which I think is quite a long time to be, you know, in a much smaller pool. But what was a bit strange is this Metflex stuff wasn't actually used in any of the other Seaworld pools. And so I found it really bizarre as to why they decided to use it in theirs. You know, surely if they weren't sure what to use, they could have just called them up. I think it's epoxy, which is what Seaworld usually uses. But actually what's quite funny is eventually I think Seaworld did say, look, you really need to shut down the pools and sort this out and use epoxy instead of Metflex. But because the whales now were so used to this type of behaviour of ripping at things, and it was probably a game and it was interesting, they would then do exactly the same to the new stuff that was there, just because they were so used to doing that type of thing. So it didn't really make much difference anyway. So they did actually bring over a few like Seaworld trainers to Spain to sort of help them out and teach them certain tricks with the whales. And I actually did find an amazing picture of Alexis and Dawn together. And it was such a wonderful photo. They looked so happy and, you know, both huge grins on their face. And I just thought that's a really lovely photo of both of them. Now, even though they were obviously over there to help them out, there was such a large turnover. So it was very difficult to know who had been trained and who hadn't, which actually led to a couple of incidents. It was actually Suzanne Alee who said in her statement, they hired a young girl. I'm not exactly sure what she was doing because she had like scuba gear on. So I think maybe she was diving to the bottom of the main pool and cleaning it. But I don't know if something had happened with her equipment, maybe the breathing apparatus stopped working or something, I don't know, but she panicked and she was trying to climb up the gate in order to get out of the tank. But the gate that she was climbing was the one that was separating her from the 4 orcas on the other side. And obviously some of the equipment or whatever she was wearing had gotten through and was sort of floating around, and it was actually two of the orcas, Kohana and Skylar, who managed to grab hold of these little bits of equipment that were obviously still attached to this young girl, and through the bars pretty much thrashed her around for quite some time. So yeah, not very good. So it sounds like she wasn't necessarily particularly trained, but I was thinking, did she have a diving certificate? Did she know how to use the equipment? Did she know how to work around big animals? Had she done a health and safety course? I mean, the list goes on of what she could have been trained for, but it sounds like she wasn't. Okay, so just quickly, I have finished this hairstyle now. So you can either just have it both on either side like that, but sometimes I like to split it and have a little bit down here. And then this one you can either have at the top just there, or you can have it at the bottom here. So I think I'm just going to leave it like that. So it's nice, quite simple and easy. How you lace it through at the top is completely up to you. It just takes a bit of practice, however you want to use it as your third strand before you start braiding. It took me about 3 or 4 goes, and there's a few different ways of doing it, so I'm sure you'll figure out a way. Okay, so back to the pool. There's something that's called skimming, which I think on the top of the pool they will skim it to make sure that there's no dirt or debris or anything like that, to make it nice and clean. But what they actually found were tiny bio balls. These were plastic canisters that were in the filtration system, which was to help lower the amount of bubbles in the pool. But obviously during the night time, or one night, they had broken down and made their way into the pool. And Suzanne recalls one morning when she came into work, and all of the pools were covered in these tiny little shards, sharp pieces of plastic, and these whales just, swimming around in it. So that sounded really awful, and I hope that they didn't ingest any of that either. So after this, again, the pools would need extensive cleaning again, and there were, I think, a few of the divers that went to the bottom, they said the bottom, that it was filthy. Even said that they found a cigarette butt down there as well, which sounds horrendous. But Miguel Diaz, who was the ocean orca supervisor, didn't want to close. He didn't want to miss out on any more money or any more shows. So they said, no, we'll keep it open, and I guess just clean whenever they could. And there was one guy called David Quintero. He was called in to, clean the bottom of this pool, and he had a spotter. So anytime there's a human in the water, they will have a spotter to make sure that everything is going okay. And he is the only one that has the key for the gate that separates him from the other orcas. So the spotter is the only one who should keep the key. However, Miguel Diaz came up and wanted the key for some reason, and this spotter, well, back then, a lot of them had been unemployed for a long time, and they were scared. They didn't want to lose their job, so of course they said, yeah, okay, you can take it. And then Miguel decided to open the gates to let out the orcas. Now, if I was the supervisor, I don't know about you, but I think I'd look into the main pool first and make sure that there was no one in it. Especially if you knew that there was a cleaner there, I think I would really want to make sure that they were safely out of the pool. So there's poor David at the bottom of the pool, who's now suddenly got 4 orcas hurtling towards him. Now, luckily, he was actually able to be pulled out just in time. But obviously that would have been very, very scary for him. And apparently he did confide in Suzanne and said, I really thought that he'd gotten out of the pool. I saw him at the surface, not too long before, and I thought that he had gotten out. But then apparently later, when he spoke to management of the actual park, he said that David deliberately dived back into the water just as the gates were opening because he wanted to make the trainers look incompetent. And I thought, right, well, okay, but if I was David, I don't think that I would purposely dive into a swimming pool with 4 orcas that could use me as a chew toy just to make a point that perhaps the trainers weren't quite as observant as they should be. I mean, I just thought that was a really bizarre thing, to mention. And shortly after, he was fired. Not Miguel. I think he probably should have been, but poor David was. So it's up to you, you can believe which other story, but I think Miguel's sounds a little bit far-fetched. So this now brings me to 2009, where Alexis was practicing for a Christmas show. So I think it was actually on Christmas Eve. They were just running through the show, making sure that, everything was running smoothly. So he obviously had Keto with him, or Keto. I'm not quite sure which one. He was actually more of the dominant male. He unfortunately decided to ram into his chest, basically crushing it, and it caused a lot of internal bleeding. And once again, at the very beginning, they decided to say that this was an accident until the autopsy report came back. Here we go. It said that there was multiple compression fractures, tears to the vital organs, and bite marks. But what I couldn't believe is that there wasn't really much media coverage on this. And I thought this should be news that would be huge. A human has lost their life in an entertainment park with captive orcas. This should be frontline news. This should be absolutely everywhere. And the most shocking part is that exactly just 2 months later is when Dawn Brancho lost her life. And I didn't quite realise until I was researching how close those dates were to each other. And Loro Parque in Spain, they ceased waterworks with the orcas. And I just thought, if I was Seaworld, would I be thinking, gosh, this is an awful thing that's happened. Oh, let's make sure our trainers are really, really safe. Let's assess it a little bit more, perhaps make things a bit stricter, or let's also cease waterworks for a little bit to investigate before carrying on as normal. But I wonder if Seaworld was also thinking, oh, well, that happened because Loro Parque wasn't great. It wasn't a fantastic facility. There was lots of things that were going wrong. And so this is why someone lost their life. But of course, it now shows you that it doesn't matter if there's a park that's struggling and not doing very well against a park that is fantastic and the facilities are, absolutely spot on. It didn't matter. There were still 2 people that lost their lives. So apparently in 2007, there was a trainer called Claudia who was working with a orca called Tekoa. And apparently Miguel Diaz somehow lost control of Keto, even though he must have been in the other pool with the gate closed. So I'm not sure how he lost control of the whale. Anyway, he came in and Keto basically rammed into the other whale, which obviously, disrupted the show quite a lot. They managed to just about get Keto into the other gate, and Claudia could actually see that the poor whale that she was working with was slightly bleeding, but apparently Miguel still notioned to her, like, carry on with the show. And there was a point at the end, which I mentioned in, I think, the first video, where a whale can get up sort of like on a viewing platform and can sort of, turn around so the audience can see all of the whale completely out of the water. And this is where, you know, she had been cut and she was bleeding into the water. I think that's a horrible thing for all these customers to see, and know that she was actually carrying on with the show, but only because she was ordered to. So, you know, I just think that's not exactly taking care of the whales, is it? I'd like to think that if you could actually see blood, that they should stop the show and look after this whale. Now, unfortunately, it was actually only 2 months later where Claudia was working with Toccoa, and she did actually attack her and almost drowned her. So again, you've got all these little signs leading up to this awful, horrible thing that happened to Alexis, and yet nothing was, you know, happening. Nothing was changing. It seemed that they were hiring these people that had no experience, and so things weren't going to go according to plan. And the fact that they had to keep shutting down because things were going wrong, you know, I think there was electrical problems that they had to sort out as well. All of this time, obviously the orcas would be in the back pools, the smaller pools, but I don't know what the noise would have been like, you know, all the banging and the drilling. I don't know, maybe that would have caused irritation, and of course having to stay in those back pools for such a long time before, you know, coming into the main pool. It sounds like they cut quite a lot of corners. But as I said, this is just the research that I found online, and quite a few of those statements were made from Suzanne Alee, who, you know, was a former employee. And so I just think, well, why on earth would she lie about most of the things that went on there? And also I have read a few other accounts that have said, yeah, the park just wasn't quite working particularly well, and you could see that, you know, it wasn't really up to quality standards. Now, Alexis was actually engaged to a beautiful young lady called Estefana Rodriguez. I hope I've said that right. And what was quite interesting, though, is leading up to the incident, he had actually voiced his concerns about working there and the safety. And, you know, he actually, I think there was a couple of times he was thinking he might leave. You know, he wasn't really sure about the place anymore. And then what was very bizarre is there was obviously the day that the attack happened, she got a phone call from Alexis, but obviously it wasn't him, it was someone working at the park. And they said, okay, there's you know, something's happened, but Alexis is all right. We just need you to come over here. Which I thought was quite bizarre, because that's almost a statement that he couldn't possibly have given, because how did he actually know? If he was in the water still with this whale, there's no possible way that he would know that Alexis was going to be all right. So I don't know if he was just trying to make his fiancée not panic until a little bit later. But I just think in those times you want to be truthful to family and partners. And can you guess who actually called her? It was Miguel Diaz. He was the one who said he's okay. Now, after this, in court, when they actually asked Seaworld, you know, is this a company to do with you? You know, is this part of Seaworld? And they came back and said no, which I think is true. You know, they are two separate parks. And they said, are they accustomed to the training of Seaworld? And as I said before, they had trainers coming over to, you know, help them with the orcas and help them with the tricks and train them the way they do at Seaworld. And yet still Seaworld came back and said no. which is even more bizarre because apparently there was actually someone from Seaworld on that day that the attack happened. They were actually overseeing this show. And I can't believe that they would have blatantly just mentioned this and said, no, we've pretty much had nothing to do with them since giving them these 4 whales. Or maybe the person in the courtroom didn't know that they are supposed to be working and trained like Seaworld trainers, but I don't know. That seems a little bit of a stretch. You think if they're going into court, they're going to send the people who know all of the information. So it just sounds like they were trying to step back and go, oh, no, we had nothing to do with the park in Spain. So I'm going to end this video by saying that my heart goes out for Alexis and his family, and of course Estefana. You know, I think it was a horrible, awful thing that happened, and I think he was a wonderful person, and it's just so sad that an amazing person had to lose his life. 2 months later, someone else lost their life. It's just awful. So that now concludes episode 3. Definitely stay tuned for episode 4, where we will be talking about a few other incidents and things that have also happened at Seaworld, some with killer whales and actually some with slightly different animals.